trying to get the computer to work so I could show you some of the data from that report, but unfortunately I wasn't able to. But we have some copies of the report and executive summaries in the back, and you can go to our website to see the charts. But in the book, you'll see we have per country, and what you'll notice, if you can sort of see, on page, let's see, 63 of the full report. This is for Human Rights Watch. You'll see a red line which shows the reporting on women's issues, and then a blue line which is reporting for the country as a whole. And we found similar issues for both NGOs. What we found was that in general there was not much attention paid to women's rights in the Middle East. But another interesting data point was that it appeared that the international NGOs were focusing their reporting around armed conflict. So whenever there was an armed conflict, you would see a spike in the reporting. And you can see that very clearly on the charts. Afghanistan, for instance, after the NATO bombings in Afghanistan in 2001, following September 11th, you'll see a huge spike in the amount of reporting for Afghanistan. Similarly, Lebanon, you'll see spikes for various conflicts. And then, of course, once the Arab Spring took place in 2011, you will see pretty much all the countries that was involved with the protests jump up in their reporting. And so I thought that was an interesting fact, that why was there so much focus on armed conflict? And that perhaps there have been a lot of research studies done that in countries where they have full equality for women, attention to women's rights, that those countries are more democratic, they have better protection for human rights as a whole, and there's often less conflict. And so the data seems to show that, really there needs to be, from the international community, the international human rights community, greater attention paid to women's rights before there's an armed conflict. This morning they had the talk about sexual violence in the DRC, and I think in terms of what's going on in Syria and the other countries in the Middle East, it's really something that when there is not an armed conflict, people really need to be paying attention to in order to try to affect change there. And so that's something that with this event and the work that we do, we want to call attention to that so it's at the top of the international agenda, because too often it isn't. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Einat Wilf, who is a former member of the Israeli Knesset, who will be speaking on these issues today. She's been unfortunately very sick, so hopefully her voice, we're thrilled that she was able to make it. So I hope her voice holds out through the talk and we can take some questions at the end. But I'll just give you a brief introduction. Dr. Wilf is a fellow with the Jewish People Policy Institute and an adjunct fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She was the chair of the Education, Sports, and Culture Committee, chair of the Knesset Subcommittee for Israel and the Jewish People, and a member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in the 18th Knesset. She was a member of the Labor Party and then also broke away with the Atzmaut Party during her time in the Knesset. She previously served as a foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres, who's now the president, and a strategic consultant with McKinsey & Company. She was born and raised in Israel. She's the author of 3 books that explore key issues within Israeli society. She has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and her PhD from the University of Cambridge. And she's a great speaker, and I look forward to hearing her remarks. Thanks.
Thank you. So I guess having my voice silent, let me see, is this on? Yes. Okay. I guess having my voice silenced will be an experience in being a woman. It's not something that I've typically had experience in, so bear with me, and I'll do my best to speak. Can you hear me at all? I have no sense if you can hear me. Can you? Yes? Okay, thank you. So despite my voice and despite being sick, it was important for me to be here because I care deeply about the issue of women. I care deeply about women's rights, and I care deeply about women's rights in the Middle East. As I will discuss, I view it as a critical issue for any country, for any woman, and in general, also as we look at the prospects for peace in the Middle East. So several years ago, when the revolutions in the Arab world began, what we call the Arab Spring, I was frequently asked, where is this heading? Can we look for an optimistic scenario, a pessimistic one? What's going to happen? And I had one answer, and the answer was follow the women. Where the women will go, the revolutions will go. If we will see the situation of women in the Arab world improving, we will know that the Arab Spring has been truly a spring. If we will see the situation of Arab women deteriorate, we will know that the spring was short-lived and that the pessimistic scenarios are the ones that are taking shape. And I think this is still true. I think elections are not an indicator. The various declarations of various leaders are not an indicator. I think the only reliable indicator of what's going to happen in the region, in the Arab world, is what's going to happen to women. And this is across the world true, but it is definitely true in the Arab Middle East, where the women will go, the Middle East will go. This is the best indication of human rights. We sit here at the Human Rights Council, but in reality, if we really want to know where human rights are heading, we should look at women in each and every country. I think except for 2 or 3 countries in the world, in Northern Europe and Scandinavia, no country can declare complete victory when it comes to women's rights, to the equality of men and women. We are all still fighting for women's rights, for human rights. But when it comes to the Arab Middle East, we are really talking about the worst possible situation. But we really need to know we care about human liberty, we care about human freedom. I will say that until women are free, no one is free. No country can be considered free. No country can be considered to have liberty if women don't have it. So if we follow the women in the Arab Middle East, what are we seeing? Generally, all indicators, and they have remained such before the revolutions in the Arab world, and they are generally still so today, are at the bottom of the list. Whether you will look at expert panels, whether you look at the World Economic Forum gender gap, UN indicators, generally the countries of the Arab Middle East perform worst when it comes to the situation of women. Some a little better, some worse, but generally taken together, they are at the bottom of the barrel. There are some elements, islands of progress, elements of light. The biggest light, of course, is the country that started the revolutions in the Arab world, which is Tunisia. Tunisia, which is the country that started the revolutions, was always considered the most progressive of all the Arab countries, is again the most progressive of all Arab countries. There were 2-3 years of concern that the country would be taken a step back. The Islamist party that won the majority of votes there was trying to introduce some regressive measures, but ultimately failed. And Tunisia has a constitution that at least promises progress. Promises at least not to go back on the progress already made, and perhaps even further progress. Now we should remember, this is only a constitution in writing. If we know anything from countries, there's a big difference between constitutions and practice, especially when it comes to women. But if there's any light in the Arab world today, it is to be found in Tunisia, and everyone is looking at it, and so are we, in the hope that this would indicate something very positive. Now, There's something else about Tunisia. Some feminist leaders in Tunisia said that one of the reasons they're happy that the equality of men and women is now part of the Tunisian constitution is that this way it becomes clear that the equality of men and women, the liberation of women, is not a Western value. Now, I think this is one of the most important statements that needs to be made. The equality of men and women is not a Western value. The liberation of women is not a Western value. I think there has to be a very clear statement, especially coming from the Human Rights Council, that there's no such thing as moral relativism when it comes to women. We cannot talk about the rights of women as something that is culturally dependent, as something that is Western. If we allow that, if we allow countries to claim tradition as a way to subjugate women, we are committing a crime against human rights. I can share my own experience as a member of parliament in Israel. In Israel, we have a minority of very religious Jews who use Jewish law in order to run a community that is very conservative towards women. This is something that within Israel I fought against and I reject completely. The use of religion, the use of tradition to justify the subjugation of women is something that should not be accepted in any religion, any tradition, any culture, any civilization. The equality of men and women, it should be proclaimed, is a universal value. It's an absolute value. It's not relative. It's not a Western value. It is an absolute good, and we have to fight for it as such. Now, other than Tunisia and the other big country of the revolutions in the Arab world, which is Egypt, in Egypt, the situation is actually grim. Illiteracy, sexual harassment, rape, genital mutilation, anything that is at the top of the aggravation against women is to be found in Egypt. However, the new constitution, which is by no means democratic, democracy in Egypt brought about the Muslim Brotherhood and a deterioration in the status of women. The non-democratic counter-revolution is now in force. There's now a new constitution which is progressive, which assures the equality of men and women, which again shows us that, especially in the Arab Middle East, given the situation, democracy doesn't necessarily bring a better situation for women. Sometimes actually much worse, because democracy brings about many regressive forces, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, efforts to enshrine Islamic law, which is very regressive towards women. So right now, Egypt at least promises to begin to reverse the deterioration of the last 3 years, but even so, it is still considered in all surveys, all measures, one of the worst countries in the world for women, except for a small elite. But other than that, one of the worst places in the world. So Egypt, the major country of the Arab revolutions, has officially the promise of progress towards women, but in practice, we're not even close. And other than that, across the Arab world, we're not seeing improvements. Here and there, there's some window dressing. The Saudis are telling women that they can begin voting in municipal elections, which don't matter for anything. Saudi Arabia is a country that, by all measures, should be considered a country that is exercising a full-fledged form of apartheid against women. Women are basically disbarred from any participation in society. They are not full people. They are treated like children who need men to approve of anything they do. Of course, all the situation of violence, all of these situations are at the bottom. So again, we should not think that all these kind of window dressing, putting some women in the parliament there, allowing them to vote for municipal elections here, all of that is not changing the fundamental situation, which is dire. Now, one of the reasons that, as I mentioned, I also care about these issues is that Israel within the Middle East, even though by all measures belongs more to the Western countries, struggles with the fact that we have two large minorities, one very religious Orthodox Jews that use Jewish tradition and Jewish law in a very regressive, conservative interpretation of it in order to push women away from the public sphere. And also Israel has a very large Arab Muslim minority, 20%. It's the largest Muslim minority in the world, percentage-wise. And also there we have to fight with the question of, do we respect tradition if that tradition is offensive to women? And in both of these minorities, Israel is struggling with the question of what does it mean to respect a tradition when that tradition is actually used to subjugate women, to push women away from the public sphere. In small measure, it's nothing like what you see in the Arab world, but still, I think it's very important to have a strong universal voice, especially here in the Human Rights Council, that says no tradition, no religion, no law, no civilization can be used to justify the inequality of women, the subjugation of women. The equality of women is not a relative value, and it is not a Western value. Now, I want to say something specific on women's rights, the Middle East, and the prospects for peace. One of the reasons that I deeply care about women in the Middle East is I think that the ability to one day see true peace and integration of Israel into the Middle East depends very much on the women and on the future of women. And the reason is that there is a tendency to view Israel as a foreign construct in the Middle East, a country that is different. And sometimes criticism is leveled that Israel is not doing enough to integrate into the region and into the Middle East. But I can tell you that for many years when I've heard that criticism, my thought was always, I'm a woman in Israel, in the Middle East, and there is absolutely nothing that I want to integrate into in the Middle East. If I look at all the countries around Israel, in any direction, in quite a wide radius, as a woman, I have nothing to look forward to. I have nothing to appreciate. And again, this is something that has to be said. We are often so careful, so correct about respecting different countries, different traditions, different religions. But if the outcome is that women are segregated, subjugated, enslaved, then what is there to respect? What is there to be integrated into? Why should Israel want its women to be integrated into a Middle East that treats its women in that manner? And since I do want to see one day peace, and I do want to see Israel integrated into the Middle East, I want to make sure that the integration is forward rather than backward. And the only way it will happen is if we can one day look forward to countries that are not just democratic and free and open, but countries that truly respect the equality of men and women, that respect minority rights, that respect gay rights. All of these come together. And I think by seeing that, we will see also the possibility of peace becoming very easy. Now, I know that in many ways Israel, especially among the Arabs, is not someone or not a country that can speak on these issues, not considered a player. I can tell you that often when I participate in conferences on women's issue, the fact that I'm a woman matters less than the fact that I'm Israeli, that I'm Jewish. Arab women do not view me as a colleague. They will not shake my hands. They will not speak to me because as far as they're concerned, the national conflict, the religious conflict is far greater than our association as women. But I will ignore that. I know it exists. But I will ignore that because recently I had an opportunity to hear Natan Sharansky. He was a very famous prisoner in the Soviet Union, a prisoner of conscience, because he was Jewish. And he said something very interesting. He said that during the darkest day of the Soviet Union, when they were in prison, when they were in the gulags, he said the prisoners of conscience, the dissidents, they knew that behind the iron wall there was the United States and that the United States was with them. And he said that was something very important. And he used that to discuss the question of whether the United States is with dissidents today in the Middle East. But I think it's important that even if Israel is hated by Arab countries, considered illegitimate, that Arab women view me as an enemy more as a colleague and a woman, that they should know that behind that iron wall, behind that conflict, the women of Israel are with them. And the women of Israel support their struggles and support their struggles for equality. I can tell you I was moved to see the women of Saudi Arabia fighting for something so basic as their right to drive. I think a lot of Israeli women and men went to support them on Twitter and Facebook in whichever way possible to show our support. So even though we may not be viewed as colleagues for that struggle, I want them to know that we are there and we do support them. I just want to end by saying a couple more things. Another reason I think that we're here raising this issue, especially with NGO Monitor, is I think the women of the Middle East and Israel find themselves at two opposite poles of the human rights discourse. Israel too much and women too little. Israel finds itself at the receiving end where the human rights discourse is being abused in order to single out Israel, in order to demonize Israel, and to do nothing with the promotion of human rights. And what the report shows about women is that the human rights discourse is not sufficiently used to protect the most important human rights, which are women's rights. And I hope that this report will help push human rights organization and the Human Rights Council to focusing on women's rights. And finally, I want to say, one of the reasons that we're seeing such a massive backlash against women in the Arab Middle East is because feminism is the only 19th century idea to survive into the 21st century as a revolutionary force. All the other isms of the 19th century, the 20th century have risen and fallen. But feminism has gone from strength to strength. Feminism is a revolutionary force. The Arab countries our right to view the equality of men and women as a subversive force, as a dangerous force. It is. It intends to subvert existing power structures. It is a revolutionary force. No society is ever the same once the ideas of equality of men and women are introduced. It changes the power structure. It changes the societies. Nothing is ever the same. And this is why we see, even in the most advanced Western societies, when women progress, there's always backlash. And in the Middle East, the backlash right now is severe. It's harsh. It's powerful. Because democracy can come and go, can ebb and flow. But if feminism will take over the Middle East, nothing will remain the same. Everything will change. And that's why we're seeing such a severe, serious, and violent backlash against women across the Middle East. And we have to be there with the women to make sure that there is progress. Because, yes, in general, the direction of feminism is forward. Feminism is winning. Feminism will win. The equality of men and women will be the governing value of the 21st century. But it doesn't mean that there won't be periods of severe backlash. And we need to fight against those periods of backlash, against those periods that seek to subjugate women even more in the name of tradition, family, religion. All of these are excuses. So anything you can do to make your voice heard and to make sure that human rights organizations and the Human Rights Council take up the cause of women's rights in the Middle East, you will do a great service to the women of the Middle East, and I will say to the cause of peace in the Middle East as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Einat. Does anyone have any questions?